Good morning, everybody. I'd ask everyone to take their seat, please. Good morning. I wanted to welcome everyone. I'm Maureen Hurley. I'm one of the organizing committee members of our Movement to Restore Trust. I want to welcome you all here today. We have also a number of other members of our organizing committee who are with us this morning, including John Hurley. John said, whatever you do, don't touch the microphone, so sorry about that. Nancy Nielsen up here at this table. Dominic Perry, who's from Leadership Roundtable, who'll be chatting with us later on. Tom Beecher, Carl Montante, Stephanie Argentine, who's been the facilitator extraordinaire of our group. Mary Murphy is right over there, and who did I leave out? Who's here? Anyone else? Oh, where's Nancy? Oh, Nancy's the Walmart greeter at the door. She's giving everyone the scoop on what to do. Anyway, welcome to everyone. How many of you remember the beginning of this journey on November 28th? How many of you were here that night? So a good number of you. That's the night we sort of began this journey, and after incredible 10 weeks of really hard work by the 6 groups that came together, we're proud to get to this point today and want to thank all of you again for the work as well as being with us today. So we know we have folks here today who worked on each of the work groups. We have others who registered on the website and expressed an interest, and we also have folks that just continue to be interested in what we're doing. So we welcome everybody today. So we have 3 objectives for today. One is to update you on sort of what happened to the work that we all did as part of our groups. The second is to, and related to it, is to give you an update on the several conversations that we've had with the bishop. And the third is to kind of lay out what we think are the next steps and kind of our pathway forward. So we'll be taking a little bit of time to do that. We're going to do that in a couple ways. We're going to start this morning with a prayer, and then we're going to hear from a survivor. We'll give you, as I said, a report on the MRT, the process, and kind of where we stand today. Our discussions with the bishop. We will have some time for Q&A. We won't have a chance to hear from everybody today, but we have cards on the tables that we'd ask folks to do a couple things with. One is write down any questions that you might have as you hear the different presentations, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can. If you have other comments or ideas or thoughts, please record them. And then later on, as we get ready to wrap up today, we're going to ask about who of you is interested in staying actively engaged as we get into the next phase of our work. So we'll talk about that a little bit more at that point. As I mentioned, we have Dominic here, who's then going to give us some observations from Leadership Roundtable, and is going to help us with our path forward, and then we'll wrap up today with an outline of our next steps. So I mentioned earlier that today is really about updating all of you, those that have kind of stuck with us here through this process. It's not an open mic or town hall. As I say, we're just, for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to hear from everyone, but we'd like to get any of your thoughts or notes or ideas on those cards, so please use them. And with that, I'm going to invite Mary Ellen Twist to come up, but I do want to mention that the bishop asked us to keep him in his prayer, in our prayers today. He is meeting with the Pastoral Council at the exact same time we are at this meeting this morning, and he asked us to please keep him in our prayers, which we said we would do. So with that, I'd like Sister Mary Ellen to come up and start us off with a prayer. You want me to put it up? I'll advance it. Oops. There we go.
Good morning. There is a poem on our screen today, and the title of the poem is Trasna. It's a Gaelic word that refers to crossroads. If you've ever been to Ireland and you are in the countryside and you come to the crossroad, there are many, many signs pointing in every direction, many choices. I would just ask you to take a moment to reflect on this poem. I will read it, and then we'll conclude with a prayer. A crossroad is a time for opportunity, but it's also a crisis time. The pilgrims paused on the ancient stones in the mountain gap. Behind them stretched the roadway they had traveled. Ahead, mist hid the track. Unspoken, the question hovered. Why go on? Is life not short enough? Why seek to pierce its mystery? Why venture further on strange paths, risking all? Surely that is a gamble for fools or lovers. Why not return quietly to the known road? Why be a pilgrim still? A voice they knew called to them, saying, "This is Trasna, the crossing place. Choose. Go back if you must. You will find your way easily by yesterday's fires. There may be life in the embers yet. If that is not your deep desire, stand still. Lay down your load. Take your life firmly in your two hands. Gently, you are trusted with something precious. While you search your heart's yearnings, what am I seeking? What is my quest? When your star rises deep within, trust yourself to its leading. You will have the light for first steps. This is Trasna, the crossing place. Choose. This is Trasna, the crossing place. Come. Oh God, there is a sense that we are at the crossroads of a new future, linked with our past, yet different from it. There is a sense that something is aching to be born anew. Someone is calling us forward. Someone is leading us onward. We call to each other to enter deeply into the richness of this journey, to walk where there are no paths, to accept the challenge of shared visions, to delight in the demand of the gospel, to continue asking the questions. Good and Holy Spirit, be with us in this work. Amen.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. I want to welcome now Deacon Mike McKeating, who's going to come up and share his story.
Good morning. Well, my witness is in some ways very different from the one you heard at our first meeting. It's, you might say, less egregious. What happened was less physically traumatic. But in a way, the two witnesses are bookends for what we're dealing with here, which is the subject of sex abuse in the church and of its effect on victims and survivors. So this happened a lifetime ago, in 1961. I had just turned 16. I was a junior in high school. I was going to Bishop Fallon High School, which is now a car wash. And for those of you who don't know, the Delta Sonic KISS University on Main Street is what used to be Bishop Fallon High School. And so it was on the west side. Most of the kids were Italian kids from the west side, and then there was maybe a dozen or so Irish kids from Tonawanda, and I was one of those. So I had a friend who I used to hang out with. His name was Kevin McKay, and he lived on Edward Street, Elmwood and Edward on the west side. He lived in the former rectory of Immaculate Conception Church. When they built the current, what became the current rectory, his family bought the old rectory, which was right across the parking lot. And he had a big family. There was 6 or 7 kids, and they lived in the rectory. So I used to go over there and hang out with them, and we would go either across the parking lot to Immaculate Conception and play basketball, or we would go to Butler Mitchell Boys Club and play basketball. But first, I went to his house, and his parents would always be in the kitchen, and very often with a priest who was weekend assistant at Immaculate Conception next door. He was a French teacher at Bishop Turner High School. That was his assignment. But he had an assignment, he was assigned to live at Immaculate Conception and function as a weekend assistant there. His name was Howard Slack. And so I would go over there. He would almost always be there with Kevin's parents, and they would be drinking coffee and playing cards and things. And he would chat with me, and he would ask me all kinds of questions about what I was doing and what I was taking in school and stuff. And he seemed to show an interest in me. Yes? Pardon? Oh, okay. You having trouble hearing me? All right. They told me not to touch the microphones. So I'll sort of lean forward and do the best I can. Okay, so he would talk to me and sort of chat me up and, you know, what are you doing? What are you taking to school? What are your hobbies? So on. And I thought, oh, this is cool. You know, this priest is interested in me. I didn't think anything untoward about it at all. So I had a part-time job at a restaurant. I was a busboy at the Syracuse restaurant on North Bailey in Amherst. And I worked 3 or 4 nights a week there from 5 to 9. So one night I'm working in the restaurant, and he comes in near closing time on a slow night. It's probably maybe a Tuesday or a Thursday. He comes in for dinner, and it's almost closing time, and he's sitting there by himself having dinner, and I was serving his table, you know, bringing him water and bread and clearing the table and stuff like that. And he was chatting with me. And he was, by the way, he knew that I was studying French, and he used that as sort of a hook to, you know, he would speak to me in French and stuff, and I thought that was cool. And so he says at one point, what time do you get off work? And I said, 9 o'clock. And he said, would you like a ride home? And I didn't know anything about grooming. You know, the term didn't exist in those days. I thought, well, this is very nice. Yeah, I would, because it's cold out. And I used to walk to work. It was and back. It was about a mile and a half each way. So I said, sure, I'd like a ride. He said, well, I'll wait out in the parking lot for you. I have a Buick LeSabre. When you get off, just come out and get in the car. So I said, okay. So I finished my work. I went out and got in the car. We start driving down North Bailey. He turns right on Long Meadow Road. And, okay, that was the way to my house. And all of a sudden, his hand is going up the inside of my thigh and into my crotch. And he's feeling around for, you know what? And I just froze for probably a minute or two. I just was in total shock. I didn't know such things happen. I was, and you won't, a lot of you won't believe this because you had to grow up in the 50s. And as I look around, there aren't too many here that grew up in the 50s, some, but not too many. It was truly an age of innocence. We didn't know anything. You know, television at the time, during half of that time, there was one channel, Channel 4. And then Channel 2 came in, and then in the 60s, Channel 7 came in. There was no cable, nothing like that. Television went off the air about 10 o'clock at night. And primetime television were shows like Lassie, Leave It to Beaver, the Ozzie and Harriet Show, Lucy and Desi. And it was all so wholesome. You know, everything was, you know, the traditional family, mom, pop, 2 kids. The father never seemed to work. He was always home. The mother didn't work. And, you know, it was just, everything was idyllic. We didn't know anything. There was no pornography. The worst thing around was Playboy, and they wouldn't sell it to minors, and it was kept behind the counter in the drugstore. And, you know, and it wasn't even really what we would call pornography today. So we were really innocent. And I didn't know what same-sex attraction was. I didn't know that there was such a thing as men who molested boys. We just didn't know those things. It may be hard for you to believe today, but it's true. So I just froze for a minute or two, and then I thought, what am I going to do? And I looked at him, and I wasn't afraid of him. I was a pretty good-sized kid and played football and stuff, and I thought, well, I could just punch him in the mouth. But then I remembered that they taught us in religion that you get excommunicated if you hit a priest. So I don't know if that's true, but that's what they taught us. So I thought I better not do that. So then I realized there's a lot of stop signs on this street. So the next time we come to a stop sign, I'm just going to open the door and jump out. So I did. The next time we came to a stop sign, I opened the door, jumped out, and ran. And that was it. Now, on the way home, I'm thinking about it. And I instantly knew you can't ever tell anybody this. You just can't tell anybody. For 2 reasons, and they're the same 2 reasons that all victims don't tell anybody, or don't tell anybody for many, many, many years. Number 1, I thought, nobody's going to believe me. This is so off the wall. This is like something from outer space. Everybody's going to say, that's impossible. Priests don't do that. And they won't believe me. So that was one thing. The other thing was I said, if they believe me, they're going to say it was my fault, and I'm going to get in trouble. And so I just said, I'm not telling anybody. So I didn't. And but it had an effect. It didn't have a immediate traumatic effect, and I don't have PTSD or anything like that. I went on with my life. I graduated from high school. I tried college for 1 semester. It wasn't working out, so I dropped out. We had the draft in those days. And I was going to be drafted in the Army, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to go in the Army. So I joined the Navy, and that worked out well, and spent 3 years in the Navy. Wound up in Vietnam, but as you can see, I didn't get killed. So I came home, went to college after the Navy, got married in college, had 2 children, got a job as a reporter for the Buffalo Evening News right out of college, worked as a reporter for 10 years. Then I went to law school and became a lawyer. And I had a fairly normal life. But I never told anybody. Never. I didn't even tell my wife, my buddies, nobody. But it was always there. There never was a day that I forgot it. I'd always think about it at some time or other. And it always had an effect on me, and I'll tell you in a minute what that effects were. But, so fast forward to 2002. I'd been in counseling at the VA hospital with a psychologist for about 1.5 or 2 years for some depression issues. So I'm talking to this psychologist about, she's probing about this, that, and the other thing, trying to dig into the closet and pull stuff out. And we had a good rapport. Her name was Margaret Dundon, and she had kind of the same background that I had. Grew up in an Irish Catholic family, and so on. And we connected pretty good. But it was all superficial. And then Boston happened. You all know what happened in Boston in 2002, I presume. The first big clergy sex abuse scandal. Nationwide, on the front page every day. It eventually brought down Cardinal Law, and he had to resign, and it all started with this priest, I forgot his name now. It was an Irish name, but anyway, it turned out that he had abused dozens and dozens of kids over many years, and apparently there was no statute of limitations in Massachusetts, so he did wind up getting tried and going to prison. And it had nationwide implications, that it was on the front page every day for like a year. So this is the time that part of the time that I'm going through this counseling. So one day, we're in counseling, and she was probing, and I just told her about this. And she looked at me and she said, I've been waiting for this. I've been wondering when this was going to come out. As far as I know, I didn't give her any clues. But I must have, because she knew before I said it. And she told me, I've been waiting for this. I've been wondering when it was going to come out. So after that, I started to tell a few people, but not many. Didn't go around advertising it, but I stopped being reticent about it. The effect on me was not as traumatic as it was on many. It was because what had happened was not as traumatic as what happened to Tom. I didn't get raped. There was no penetration. There was no coitus or anything like that. It was what we call unwanted touching. But by the way, what I didn't know at the time was that it was a crime, and he could have been arrested for it. As a matter of fact, it was 3 different crimes under Section 130 of the Penal Law: third-degree sexual abuse, forcible touching, and sexual misconduct. Those are all Class A misdemeanors under the penal law, and he could have been charged with all 3 of those things, and he could have gone to jail for a year on each. I didn't know that at the time, and I had no intention of going to the police, or even, I didn't even have any intention of telling my father or anybody. But now, as a lawyer, I know that it was a crime. He was, as I said, a teacher at Bishop Turner High School. So around the same time that I told the therapist, I was assigned as a deacon, a new assignment, to St. Ambrose Parish in South Buffalo. And Monsignor Stanton had just retired as pastor, but he was still around. He was kind of like a pastor emeritus, and he was still around saying Mass and stuff. So one day he was saying Mass, and I was assisting, and then we were chatting after Mass, and he mentioned to me that he had taught at Bishop Turner High School and had been vice principal there. And I said, when was that? He said, it was the early 60s. I said, really? Did you ever know a priest there named Howard Slack? He said, oh yeah, he went for boys. I said, how do you know that? He said, because I caught him one time. I said, well, what did you do? He said, I told the principal. And I said, what did he do? And he said he didn't believe me. So nothing happened at that time. But he said he got caught again about a year later. And this time the boy's parents told the bishop. I said, what did the bishop do? He said he sent him to Bemis Point, told him to go to Bemis Point and pray and stay there until further notice. Now, the diocese used to own a retreat house at Bemis Point, and it was used for a number of things. But I later found out that one thing it was used for was to send priests that got in trouble and get them out of circulation. So he said he told him to go to Bemis Point and pray until further notice. And I said, what happened then? He said he stayed there about a week and walked away. And that was the last we saw of him. But I heard he went to Spain and he died in Spain. So, okay, so now we come to last November, or last year, actually, last March. I'm trying not to touch it. Last March, you know, when the newest revelations came out, and the bishop issued the list of 42, and then he said, if anybody else, you know, has any thing, I want to know about it, so let us know, and there's this hotline. And so I wrote a 2-page single-space letter to the bishop telling him this whole story. And I also called the hotline, which is, as I now know, rings in the office of Jackie Joy in Catholic Charities in Fredonia. I didn't get through to her, left a voicemail. She didn't call me back, so I called again. Didn't get through, left a voicemail. Didn't call me. The third time I got through to her. So I gave her the story, and I said, I already wrote this to the bishop, but just I'll tell you too if you want. And I could tell she was filling in a form. She's writing down this stuff on a form. And then she says, well, what do you want? I said, I don't want anything. I just want the bishop to know the story. And that was it. So a little while later, Bishop Malone never answered my letter, but eventually, a few weeks later, I got a call from Bishop Gross. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry this happened to you, and so on. And he says, he's going on and on. He says, I checked the archives, and there really was a Father Slack. I thought to myself, well, of course there was. You think I made this whole thing up? And so, I was not very happy about that conversation. So then, so far, Father Slack's name had not come out publicly. But in August, when the big list of 112 names came out, his name was on the list. Now, I later found out that with regard to deceased priests, the protocol is that their name doesn't go on a list unless there have been 2 or more complaints found credible. And so there was at least one other besides mine. And so his name is on the list now. Of course, he's been dead a long time. There's nothing anybody can do about it except, tell the story because there's things to be learned from it. So what is the takeaway from this? The takeaway is that no matter how egregious or benign the abuse is, any sexual abuse, including any unwanted touching, even if it's only a pinch on the bum or anything like that, is, first of all, it's a crime. You need to know that. It's third-degree sexual abuse and forcible touching, which are both crimes under the penal law. But it also always causes psychological damage. It always causes some psychological damage. Now, this didn't ruin my life. I've had a good life. And I'm married, and we were married 37 years when my wife died in 2005. Had 2 kids, and they're fairly well adjusted. And, I don't have any complaints about my life at all. But there wasn't a day when this wasn't at the back of my mind somehow. And it always damages the way the victim thinks about the world and about sexual relations. It erodes trust, and in some ways makes trust nearly impossible. For example, one of the effects on me has been I have a very difficult time trusting priests. I just do, and it's just the way it is, and it's, almost a half a century later, and it hasn't changed. I mean, I've been ordained 40 years. I've worked with many priests. I can work with priests. But I always look at them like, I wonder. I never look at a priest without wondering. So it makes the victim, at the very least, constantly wary, constantly vigilant, constantly questioning. And those are the mild cases. Of course, in the more egregious cases, it leads to alcoholism, it leads to drug abuse, it leads to suicidal thoughts, and in some cases, actual suicide. So I was asked, I didn't seek this out, but when Stephanie asked me if I'd be willing to do it, I said, yes, I'll be willing to do it, because it kind of provides two bookends for what this is like. So thank you for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, for sharing that story. And we've tried to recall that throughout this process, that what brings us forward here and what is inspiring our work is the experience of people like Mike and people like Tom and so many others who have suffered as a result of sexual abuse. And we can't lose sight of that in our work. So this morning we'll be talking about some things that may sound like organizational things, but we always got to remember the things that are driving our recommendations on organizational change are the experiences of the victims of sexual abuse. So what I would like to do now is to bring you up to date on the process to date. This is the first chance for all the teams to be in a single room together and to hear about the work that you all turned out. And you have a couple of documents at your table. You have a document called the Executive Summary, which is got the movement to restore trust on the top. And I'll walk you through that, and then, of course, you take that with you and you have a chance to study it. We also have at your places a summary of nearly all of the work group recommendations, and there's some introduction to that summary at your places as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about some feedback to the groups as a result of what we saw in the reports. So let's just talk for a minute about the process. As you know, beginning on December 8th at the meeting in Science Hall, we began to break down into 6 different work groups. And the work groups we knew were not going to be completely independent of each other. They were going to naturally cover some common ground, and we expected that. And in fact, one of the things that we were interested in seeing is how different groups might come at an issue and address it. But we knew that there would be some overlap. I guess we were very encouraged at the seriousness with which the groups took up the task. Group 2, for example, on financial transparency, jumped right in, and they had their report done by year end. And it gave some encouragement to other groups. But I think throughout the process, I think we're all aware of team meetings that occurred despite questions about the weather and through the holiday season and on weekends. And, so many people have given me encouraging words, but I think it was a remarkable display of commitment and real involvement by the faithful in the diocese. So we put people on a tight time frame for developing the initial reports, and the reports really, they did come back very close to the 1st of February. And we got 6 documents, and as you might expect, with 6 different groups working independently on 6 different topics, and in having 6 different conversations, we ended up with 6 very different reports. And I think we might have thought at one time that our job as an organizing committee was to take those reports and massage them a little bit, but more or less weave them into a single report and deliver a complete document. And as we looked at the reports, we soon realized that that wasn't going to be possible. We couldn't do justice to the reports and retain a lot of what you all said in those reports if we were going to do this. So we went a different way, and what we decided instead to do was to draft an executive summary that would describe we wanted to use this as a document to speak from when we met with Bishop Malone. So we wanted to describe for him what happened here and how these people got together and how many people were involved and what the process looked like. And we wanted to talk to him about things that we saw emerging out of the reports and things that we ourselves as organizing committee members had experienced in the process. So we have a section there beginning on page 2 about common themes, and these are themes that you sounded in your reports, and these are themes that we've heard in our discussions generally. And I'll tell you, we'll be reporting on our conversation with the bishop, but we had an in-depth discussion about these common themes, and face-to-face with the bishop to tell him that our sense, our very clear sense from everything that we had seen and read was that there has been a serious erosion of trust in the Diocese of Buffalo arising out of the handling of the sex abuse scandal, and that there's a lack of confidence by the laity of the church in the institutional church, and particularly here in Buffalo. We also said that the process of restoring trust is going to require transformational cultural change in the diocese, that it can't be business as usual, that it has to be accepted, and then we have to go to work on it. It won't happen overnight. We don't necessarily blame the bishop for the culture, because that culture is one that has been developed over decades in the church and in the diocese. But the bishop is in a position to start that process of change, and he has to be there, to be a leader on that. But we told him being that leader means he isn't the one who alone decides what and when to do it, that he's got to work in an active partnership with us. And so we have in bold on page 3 that central to our recommendations is this conclusion that trust will only be restored when the bishop demonstrates that he is committed to working in active partnership with the laity on the matters identified in this report. Because we see, and we've heard this again from your reports, at the root of so many of these issues, we think, is the whole issue of clericalism, the tendency of clergy to have placed themselves on a pedestal above the laity, and it has created that culture. And then finally, a theme that emerged. We looked at this a lot in our group 5, our working group 5, but it came out in other group reports too, that the church seems to have lost its way on Vatican II as being the inspiration for the involvement of the laity in the life of the church, and that we needed to recapture that encouraging time of the church after Vatican II. So we asked the bishop that he thinks about how can we demonstrate a recommitment to the principles of Vatican II? And several of the groups actually dug into the Vatican II documents and used that as a basis for their recommendations. So with those common themes, we began to look at the detailed recommendations, and Stephanie's going to go through those with you. But by way of introduction, let me just tell you that we began to draw back from the recommendations, the specifics, and we said, there's a lot of good work here, and could we distill it down into some prerequisites, if you will, things that really need to be in place before we can think about working on specifics. And so we came up with this idea of, well, are there foundational recommendations that arise out of the report? Maybe they're shared across reports, and that's what Stephanie will go through with you now, as well as the specific recommendations. Steph.
So this is what John was just talking about in terms of the common themes. So I offered to the sponsors to, I'm just one of you guys. I just joined up with, group one, and then I offered to the sponsors to help them distill the reports when it was pretty clear there was 50 pages of reports from the work groups in total. So there's a lot of content, and for whatever reason, I've got I don't know, I like reading things and finding themes and patterns and stuff. So I offered to do that, and they took me up on it. So, and it was hopefully when you see these themes, you can see the work that you did someplace reflected in them. Maybe not in the exact language that you used, but kind of the core and the root and the crux of each work group's recommendation is reflected in here someplace. So what we wanted to do was to distill it down into something that was more manageable for the sponsors to talk with the bishop about, but have it still be authentically true to the recommendations that came out of the work groups. And, if I was just, whoops, don't touch the mics. I was just looking through my notebook of kind of all the reports, and I've got cross-references to different work group reports and page numbers and all kinds of craziness. And it looks really neat and pretty here, but hopefully you can see your work. So what we found in terms of the 9 themes were committing to a partnership with the laity to restore trust. That was kind of maybe in the background in all of the reports and front and center in at least a couple. And similarly, number 2, embracing the opportunity to act voluntarily now. That may not have been exactly what any of the groups said, but it was definitely, the urgency was reflected in the tenor and the messaging of all the reports. Our work group 1 had a fair amount of content about addressing the needs of survivors for support and healing, but it was implicit in all the other groups as well. Transparency was obviously a big one. 2 of the groups worked on that, both the scale of the abuse in human terms as well as the financial piece. Group 2 was, and group, I think 4 and 5 also had strong themes around the role of the faithful in the organizational structures of the church, as well as in the delegation of greater authority to the, we ended up calling them consultative bodies. So each group talked about different organizing committees, councils, and those kinds of things within boards, within the diocese, and we collectively called them the consultative bodies. And various groups talked about different ones in specific, but the theme was to delegate greater authority and autonomy to them as well. Establish accountability. So again, coming out of numerous work groups, there was a theme about both the accountability as well as periodic review for implementation as well. And then we had representatives from Leadership Roundtable at the very first symposia, and a strong recommendation to engage them to help us. So I don't know if you guys remember, but the organizing sponsors, when they started this journey, thought they were going to work themselves out of a job. I think that's actually in the mission statement someplace. And it became clear that this was going to take a longer haul and a longer effort. And so we felt it was important to engage the expertise of the Leadership Roundtable to help with that, both from a structure and an expertise type standpoint. So that was recommendation and foundational theme number 8. And then, as John alluded to already, reviving the spirit of Vatican II. So those were the foundational themes. Hopefully when you look at them, you see the work that you did. In addition, what you've got on your table is a handout. It's multiple pages, and so we didn't put it up here. But if you find it, it's the one that looks like this document. So it's in landscape mode, and it has some introductory comments, as well as, an additional 2 pages, 2.5, 3, 5 pages, I think, of the actual summarized recommendation. So I read all the reports and specifically pulled out the recommendation. And it may be a little bit rephrased, but it should be the intent was for every group's recommendation to be there. Now we had conversations about how factually accurate the reports need to be and the recommendations needed to be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end and what we may want to do to refine the reports to have them be fully ready, because the intent is to give all 50 pages of the reports both to the bishop and make them publicly available. So that's the status of the process to date. And I will pass it back to John and some other members of the organizing committee to talk about the meetings with the bishop.
We had, I'm going to be joined by members of the organizing committee who attended 2 meetings that we had with the bishop. And so what happened is we drafted the executive summary, and then working with Father Peter Corrales, the Vicar General, I said, we'd like to schedule a meeting with Bishop Malone. And we're having this symposium at Canisius on March 9th, so I'd like to get to him as soon as possible, because we would like to share with him the results of this report, and then we would like to give him a week or so to think about it, and then we'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting to get his reaction so that we could talk to the assembled group here today about that. And I remembering Sister Mary Ellen, our group meeting that one Saturday in the lower level science hall, and one of the people in our group said, well, what's going to happen here? And we're going to do these reports, and then what's going to happen? And I said, well, we're going to give the bishop the report, and then it's not going to disappear, because we're going to follow up. And and someone wanted to know, well, how long? And I said, well, it's going to be pretty quick, like I'm thinking a week or 2. Assuming that we can get it done. And so, miracles of miracles, it happened. So we met with the bishop on February 27th, and we presented the executive summary to him. And I will I'll characterize that meeting as productive. I mean, the bishop said all the right things about affirming our work, believing in our work. He reminded me that he's a Vatican II priest. He's firmly committed to Vatican II. He said, I'll have to study this, but as I look at your foundational recommendations, there's nothing here jumping off the page that tells me that that there's anything that I've got to be worried about. But he said, I would like to see what those specific recommendations look like. And we said, well, okay, so we want Bishop at some point to just give you the full reports, because they're interesting. I said, for the most part, these were amateurs working at this, but what they came up with is really rich stuff, and you should read it in its unedited form. So he said, yeah, I do want to see it. But I said, we'll give you the recommendations. So we gave him an earlier draft of the paper that you have that had the recommendations, and I will say there was some initial maybe pullback saying, oh, well, this is all going to take so much time. And I said, well, why don't we do this, Bishop? Let's try to focus our energy on just getting to the first step. Can we agree that the 9 foundational recommendations are a basis on which we can proceed? And can we talk about bringing Leadership Roundtable into the picture to help work with us on how this might be done? And can we begin to get to a point where there maybe is a series of recommendations or announcements that we would make where we could stand side by side and say, yes, this is the basis on which we're going forward. So So we said, fine. So then we had a meeting this past Tuesday, the second meeting, and at that meeting, he gave us that letter that and he told us we were free to release any or all of this letter that we wanted. So we decided to just release it all in its entirety and not quote from it, and so you have it. So you'll see in that letter, he expresses general support for the main principles and the 9 foundational themes, which I think is important as a prerequisite. He says this includes the possible engagement with Leadership Roundtable, and there's an update on that. And he proposes a joint implementation team with representatives of the Movement to Restore Trust, the Presbyteral and Pastoral Councils, and possibly diocesan staff. And I will tell you that when I heard that he read the letter to us first at the meeting, when I first heard that, I thought, oh, here it goes. Our movement is going to be sucked into the diocese, and now we're going to be on the diocesan clock. But we talked about that, and he said, oh, no, he understands our group will remain independent, and this joint implementation team will report to the movement and to the bishop. And so he respects our independence, and he understands the need for us to remain independent. So we've got that covered. So we said, well, let's see if we could move ahead on the Leadership Roundtable, because they, as you'll hear from Dominic, he'll describe what they do, but we view them as an important element here to take all this amateur work and to shape it into something really professional. So just yesterday afternoon, I got an email from the bishop. Now, we're moving at lightning speed here. This is from Tuesday to Friday, and he confirmed to me yesterday and told me that I could announce this morning, that the diocese will retain Leadership Roundtable, and he's working out the details of that engagement. He had a conversation with Dominic and Michael Broff from Leadership Roundtable. We had asked whether it would make sense for members of our organizing committee to meet with the co-chairs of the Presbyteral Council. This is the Priest Council. So that's Fathers Mancuso and Lapuma. And we thought, because we've had some priests involved, but not many, we thought it would be good to get the perspective of the priests on where we find ourselves right now and where we think we're going. So he endorsed that, and he said Father Lapuma was very enthusiastic about that, and so we'll get that set up. We've also talked about the possibility of some other meetings to maybe shore up some of our information gaps that we saw in the report. You know, we needed to get some more factual background, and we're working on that. So from my perspective, I think this is, well, from anyone who's dealt with the church, we had some laughs at the meeting about maybe working in Carl Montanti time versus working in church time, and but I think there's a lot to be encouraged about here, myself, and I think we've moved very quickly from February 27th to March 9th to reach a consensus on this. So with that, I'll pause, and well, we've got 4 members who were at one or both of the meetings with the bishop, and happy to have any insights you might have, additional insights. So Tom, go ahead. Okay.
Don't touch
Yeah, you
the
can
microphone,
touch those mics.
but I want you to hear me. I was at the first meeting, but not the, thanks, Nancy. Oops, well, now I'll hold it. I couldn't do it. You broke it. I was at the first meeting, not the second meeting, and I must say I was encouraged, but I also have practiced law for 60 years as of September, and I'm not naive, and as I happened to be sitting next to the bishop, and I turned to him when he was smiling and welcoming, I said, Bishop, the devil is in the details, because the deeper you dig, the more inclination there will be to push back, because there is a substantial change in the power structure that we're proposing. We are taking power from a group that's had it forever and moving it to the group that's in this room. And that will not be easy, but I do believe it's possible. I think the final thing I'd say is we really need to follow the Ignatian model here. Ignatius had a great expression for the Jesuits, contemplatives in action. And it's not words, it's not contemplation alone, there has to be action. And I think we've seen a good start, we need to see action on the bishop's part.
Well, I think John already said that I met with the bishop at the second meeting and emphasized the need to move fast, that we have a festering problem here that'll get worse if we don't address the issues. I am, and we all are, particularly concerned with younger people who are losing their faith in our faith, and these issues really have to be meaningfully addressed and addressed quickly. That was my takeaway, and I think as John explained, Tom just made the comment, and it's a good one. There are not any young people in our audience today. I'm sorry if I missed anyone, but that's important. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add, I was part of Group 3, and one of the things we talked about in our final meeting was this importance of balancing the appropriate amount of partnership with the bishop, but at the same time helping him focus on reality. So I think the approach that we took made sense because it wasn't, sort of in-your-face threatening. But in the second meeting, I was in both meetings, in the second meeting, we said to him outright, because he's talking about a lot of different things that they've already put in place, and we essentially said to him, Bishop, no one trusts what you're doing right now. No one in our diocese trusts what the diocese is doing. So anything that you've attempted to implement within the last 6 months has not been heard. And there was some discussion about, well, the media doesn't cover it, whatever. No, there's no trust. So I think what was most positive in my mind was an understanding, I believe, from the bishop that we have the chance in partnership to address a number of these things. Maybe there's some things they've already started that need to be, again, examined by our group to say, how do we give it the best chance of success? And to me, I think that's a little bit where the light went off around, you can either keep banging your head against the wall and not understand why people aren't listening to the different things that are being implemented, or we can look at them through the lens of a collective working with the MRT to say, these things have some possibility, and why don't we shape them together to really make them work for the Diocese of Buffalo. So that was part of what I was very encouraged about.
I was in both meetings, as was Maureen. I will say at the second meeting, it was interesting to hear some of the things that the diocese says it has done. And that was a very different take on the way those things have been done that we have heard from others. So it's as we all agreed, it's trust but verify. And so I will say that it was very cordial. There was a willingness to work together, and I think the proof of this pudding is going to be in the Joint Implementation Committee, where each work group will have members from you all and us and from the diocese, and that's where the verification is going to come, and we're going to chart a path forward.
So with that, we'd like to open up the floor for questions. Stephanie has a couple. Why don't we start with that, and then Nancy, you're going to moderate this. And then if someone wants to ask a question from the floor, there are microphones at either end. You can come up to the microphones.
They look great, Nancy.
I'm moderating this because I've had a lot of experience at controlling doctors who have a lot of strong opinions. And so just to tell you, if I cut you off, it is not personal. It is, we're not gonna have speeches. We're gonna have questions or comments, and if you could keep them brief. The best advice I ever got was be bold, be brief, be seated. So, okay, you want me to start by organizing these? Okay. Here's an important one. How can the movement engage parishes?
That is a great question, and it's one that's, we talked with the bishop about. Frankly, that's what Leadership Roundtable does. They have a methodology, and Dominic will address that specifically when he speaks next. But we understand, this is a little nucleus of people from many places. For this to become a movement, we know it has to get into every corner of the diocese.
Could I add a comment? Just to add a comment, I think a significant opportunity to begin that is we need to start to work with the priests, and starting with Monsignors Mancuso and LaPuma at least gives us an organized approach. So I think that next meeting is really critical, and we'll see what Dominic says about that, but I'm encouraged by that.
Here's a simple one. Were the diocesan attorneys at the meetings you had? The answer is no, not at either meeting.
We have suggested to the bishop that it might make sense for at least Group 1 and maybe others to meet with diocesan council to understand, just to make sure that we understand exactly how it is that certain things were done. And I think that's going to be able to be arranged.
There's a question about financial transparency. There's a lot of people interested in that. Did the bishop indicate specific acceptance of that financial transparency?
I was the organizing committee member responsible for Group 2, the financial transparency group. He hasn't seen the specifics of what we're going to demand, but in general, he has accepted the principle, at least, of financial transparency. We intend to be very demanding and very specific. We had a lot of strong points in the recommendations that we put together. He doesn't have the detail yet, but he will very shortly. And we intend to press hard on that, and we're hopeful that that could be an early breakthrough, because what we've suggested is all within the confines of existing canon law, but there's a huge role for the laity in the matter of financial transparency in the finances of the diocese. So that's going to be an early incentive program for us to have a win-win.
There are several questions about how we're going to get younger people involved in this work. Quote, while we may have wisdom or insight, they have vision and energy. Got that right. And a follow-up is
every work group touched on that at some point. I left at your tables today, and you're free to take them, this magazine from Boston College, their Church in the 21st Century. That came out in the fall, and there are several articles in there about engaging the youth in creative new ways. I was in touch with the people from Boston College when I first got the magazine. I said, could you send me some extra copies? But they said, no, we love what you're doing in Buffalo. We're going to send you a case. So take those and start to spread the word.
There are a number of questions about, specific questions about the bishop. Perhaps the most pointed, does the bishop really get it? Or is he only posing to buy time and hope it will somehow go away and business can then continue as usual? My response to that is I think he gets it, but he's going to get it more. Let me turn to others.
We didn't use the word lifeline, but we went into the discussions in our minds knowing that if he really thought about this, the MRT offers an opportunity for him to spend his remaining 2 years in Buffalo invoking change and actually taking some steps, and Dominic will talk a little bit about it from the Leadership Roundtable perspective. We were speaking with Dominic last night. He's got parishes or dioceses that would like to do the kind of work that we're doing here, but don't have the laity group in place to do it. And so I'm not quite sure the bishop yet is calling the MRT a gift, but I think that there's a growing sense that, that the fact that this many people in our diocese have taken this much time and really care about this diocese, it's becoming, I think, harder and harder to ignore that this is something that that he and our diocesan leaders should not ignore or not take advantage of.
This is an interesting take on it. There are a number about the bishop and specific questions, but this one is one that I think you should listen to. Do you think this rapid progress may lead to a premature movement toward healing prior to the bishop really acknowledging the harm caused locally. I think that, John?
You know, that is that's a very deep question. I'm not sure I have the answer. You know, I think Group 1's report has many specific recommendations about how the diocese can just do this better. And there are also practices being implemented in dioceses around the country voluntarily that I think are sounding the right note on this issue. So I guess I'm willing to say right now, I don't think that this is a you know, that we're getting sidetracked here with some initial progress, but we're not going to deal with this. I mean, I think that's why I said what I said at the beginning. We have to keep coming back to that issue. If we don't get this part of it right, the rest of it almost doesn't matter, right? It's so, and we're going to continue to be clear on that point with the bishop. So he has said all the right things. I have no reason to doubt this, but whether it's really been internalized in the way that every one of you would understand it, who can say? We just continue to pray for the work of the Spirit in this work.
A couple of questions that I can answer pretty quickly. The questions about did the bishop comment on the Pope's recent statement, or did he say he was willing to push boundaries with the USCCB? We did not talk about those things. We talked about the diocesan situation in general.
Although in our second meeting, as part of the urgency, I said to the bishop, in light of what just happened in Rome, there is a heightened urgency to do something here in Buffalo. You can't wait for Rome. I don't want to wait until the next meeting of the U.S. conference. And in fact, I had attended Leadership Roundtable's Partnership Summit in Washington on February 1st. And one of the themes that came out of the meeting that day, these are 200 lay people, cardinals, bishops, others active in the church. And one of the big themes is there are a lot of things that bishops can do voluntarily, being the person in charge of their respective dioceses. And I was encouraging the bishop, in this case, look at our recommendations and don't tell us you got to wait for the conference to do something. There are things that you can do, and you ought to look for those things and do them. They'll be very helpful. So and he understood that.
There's a question about does the bishop, a lot about the bishop here. Does the bishop accept the premise that the church is unable to police itself? One question was more a statement that the bishop should resign. I think the issue that we were faced with is he is our bishop, he is our shepherd at the moment, and we will deal with whoever is the bishop, because this is the health of our diocese, the faith of our diocese and our church, and so we will hold the feet to the fire of everybody on every side. Any other comments on that? One question, with the passage of the New York State abuse statute, how might the likely specter of diocesan bankruptcy impact the work of the movement to restore trust?
That is that's an issue that I've been thinking a lot about. Number one, I think in our reports, to the extent that we're looking for transparency and disclosure, there's going to be an impact from the reopening of the statute of limitations, because the lawyers in the room will know it. The diocese is going to be subject to lawsuits. They're going to have discovery demands in those lawsuits, and that's part of what I think we really ought to go back and the groups that were involved in disclosure recommendations. I think it would be helpful maybe to sit with diocesan council and understand what's likely to be the case with lawsuits being filed. On bankruptcy, that is a possibility. when I was in Washington at the Leadership Roundtable Summit, I spoke with the chancellor for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, they went through bankruptcy, talked to her a little bit about what happened in that bankruptcy. In some ways, you don't want to talk about something that as dire as bankruptcy, but let's be honest. In bankruptcy, one of the good things that has happened in the dioceses where it has occurred, like Minneapolis and in Milwaukee, there's a requirement that everything gets flushed out. So everything's got to be disclosed and dealt with in the context of a reorganization plan. And so our calls for transparency and for disclosure would be satisfied in that context. And I don't think that would, well, you'd have the overlay of a federal court supervising the case. So our ability to do certain things would be impacted, but I still think that the general principles that we're asserting here, they would have to rebuild from that if that came to pass. So I think everyone is hoping that that can be averted, but you really won't know until the statute opens up and the diocese sees what it's dealing with in terms of new cases.
There's another question on bankruptcy, you guys. Bankruptcy of individual parishes as well as the diocese, because parishes are independent corporations, 501c3s. This is beyond my expertise. Does anybody want to address it?
Yep, go ahead.
Under New York state law, and followed by this diocese, each parish is individually incorporated and retains on its balance sheets its own assets, which would not be liable for fault on the part of the diocese or another parish. But the assets of a diocese could be involved if there was a claim, or the parish could be involved if there was a claim against a specific parish. Let's say you had an abusing priest in a parish, the assets of that particular parish could be involved in that particular case, as well as the diocese for failure to supervise. But it's really, I think we're fortunate to have the New York law system we have, where each parish is individually incorporated. So the assets on the diocesan balance sheet do not include all of the parish churches or the assets that belong to them, nor does it include the assets of the cemetery or the hospitals or the foundation, which has substantial assets. Just to clear the air on this, the campaign recently completed where $108 million of your generous funds were donated. Those contributions were all to the foundation. If you read the documents, any of you signed a pledge card, and most of you probably did, you were not pledging to pay money to the Diocese of Buffalo. You were pledging to pay money to the foundation, which so far has not been involved in any of these lawsuits, and it probably will get named in some, but I think it's very unlikely that those assets would be subject to claims in bankruptcy or claims just in an ordinary lawsuit. So bankruptcy would be unfortunate and difficult and expensive and time-consuming. It really wouldn't wipe out all of the assets collectively held by the parishes and by the diocese. In fact, a relatively small percentage of them. So much of the assets are the real estate, the assets of the parishes, cemeteries, foundation, Catholic health system, which I think is way removed from any position of liability. Jen, you know, of course, in bankruptcy law than I am. You want to add?
Well, the other thing is that these issues were tested in the Milwaukee bankruptcy and were sustained. So they had similar laws and similar organizational structures. I know it was similar kinds of issues were raised with the Jesuits' Northwest Province, where they tried to pierce the veil of other works, tried to get at the universities out there and claim that they were responsible for the debts of the province, and that was not successful either.
One of the concerns that I've had, though, when we met with the bishop, he reminded us that he's got lots of other things on his plate that he has to deal with, replacing the CFO and a number of other issues. We emphasized that there couldn't be anything more important than reestablishing trust amongst the laity with the bishop. But given the new New York State regulations and law, my concern is that he is going to be distracted with so many other things. So we're just going to have to keep the feet to the fire and make sure that this issue and the issues that we are addressing are not pushed aside. So it's going to take, I think, even more effort than we had assumed in the past.
We have about 3 or 4 more minutes for this section. One question is, can you describe how the MRT plans to work with the public and with the press? How public are going to be the results of meetings, documents, that sort of thing? Partially addressed, I think, in the bishop's letter, but John, maybe you could, and
Yes.
Maureen.
So from the start, we've decided to be as open and as transparent as we can be. So we have regularly responded to media requests. As the groups were working, we felt we should try to keep that quiet until they had final results. But what we're releasing today, we're going to put on the website and give to the media. Going forward, the bishop suggests in his letter that the joint implementation team would be reporting to both the bishop and the MRT, and that we would decide together what would get announced. And that, I told him, I think that's a basis on which we can proceed. We can talk about how that's going to happen. I would think that it's going to be more of what you've seen already, where we'll try to keep this in the public eye. I stress to the bishop that, you know, he looks at our many of our foundational recommendations and he says, well, we're doing this or we're doing that. And I said, yeah, as Maureen said before, a lot of that is getting lost in the background, in the foreground noise. And that's why I said to him, Bishop, it would, even if we're re-announcing something, to have a series of public announcements that would demonstrate progress on this would be very helpful for you and for the diocese. And he's come around to that. He understands that. So we'll continue to keep this public. And I think the great fear, as I was saying before, out of our Group 5 was that, you know, our report would disappear in the bowels of the chancery, and they'd say, thanks for your work, and, you know, nice going, but it's not going to be like that.
The last comment is, please let the bishop point the work of the bishop to the work of the Bishop of Pittsburgh, who held many listening sessions and on Ash Wednesday posted a strategic plan of action which overlaps with many of our MRT initiatives that can be read on the Pittsburgh Diocese website. And I would just add to that Cardinal O'Malley in Boston issued a Lenten letter that was in the Boston Globe, which is really terrific. And I don't for a moment think that our bishop doesn't know about these things. Well, this one's pointed. Is there any plan B to apply financial pressure in the event that cooperation lags?
Yeah, I think Carl just whispered in my ear, it's already happening, because I'm still monitoring the collections, obviously, for Upon This Rock. Surprisingly and happily, there have been not that many people who have just said, I'm not going to complete my pledge. There were roughly 27,000 donors to that campaign. Over half of them are fully paid, and there are more than 1,000, but well less than 2,000 people who have said, I'm not giving you a cent. Collections have been a little bit slower, but they've been there. There's clearly been a decline in parish collections, significantly. Where you see it is things like the Catholic Education Dinner, where there were probably 300 people less there than there would normally be at that. So it's being felt. But I think to be more specific to that question, the Group 2's recommendations, which examine the canon law, do provide a pretty strong methodology for the laity, once they're organized and implemented, to exert substantial financial pressure on the diocese from sort of within. From outside, it's people voting with their pocketbooks or failing to pay. That's really, one could have an organized movement to do that if they needed. We haven't contemplated that because I don't think it's going to be necessary. I certainly hope not. But it's there.
We're almost at the end of our time. At the risk of taking my life in my hands, is there anybody with a burning question?
Great.
Yes. Stand up, Carrie, so we can hear you.
Sorry, on the other way of looking at the financial side is, one thing to think about with this is, people that want to put their money into this effort to support the developing of the round table and these sort of things. So that's a different way to exert our financial pressure, than maybe you might think about going forward.
Yeah, so Carrie said that for those who didn't catch it, there are people who might want to apply financial pressure by directing resources to something like the Movement to Restore Trust, as opposed to things in the diocese that they might not want to support. So someone asked me today, who pays for these refreshments at these gatherings, and it's your organizing committee.
And they're good refreshments.
We've we've agreed to bankroll this thing initially, and so we're not, and I don't think we're going to get to the point where we would be trying to compete with the diocese for fundraising. So we're gonna take care of the expenses of this, and at least along the lines of what I've seen so far. Printing, some travel expenses, some fees that we have to pay, and then some other things. But we don't plan to fundraise for the MRT yet. But I'm aware, to respond to that question, I mean, I understand that's the lever that we have, and I'm just hoping that we don't have to start talking about how we might push that one.
I just have to add one comment, and John can't make this comment, but I can. The generosity and leadership of Canisius College, Jesuit institution in Buffalo, New York, has been really outstanding, and John and the college deserve a round of applause for that.
And with that, anything else burning?
Great.
One of the most important things to me has been educating the general public and the community within the Catholics about the systemic problem child and the need to all laity that these predators are living in that laws. And how can you guys really help orthodoxies in educational programs in schools that were in place 40 years ago? I wouldn't be sitting here right now, my body shaking. That's the most important thing that I think needs to be done. And also, I think it's what most survivors want. We come forward because we don't want this to happen to other people. So what can be done
So- So the question, if you couldn't hear it, has to do with educating the public about the problem of sex abuse, how to stop it, what can we do as part of the movement to restore trust, and that's what the survivors want. They don't want this to happen to anyone else. So this will be our last question. I'll turn
Well,
it to you.
I'd say, Tom, we're with you 1,000% on that one, and it's front and center in Group 1's recommendations, and it's going to be put on the table. My own personal feeling is we're about to see in New York State just how pervasive this scourge has been, and not just by priests, but by, as you and I have talked, predators of all types. When the statute of limitations is reopened and we see just how many cases get filed, I think people are going to be astounded at how widespread the problem was. And it speaks to your concern about what do we do about educating young people that this is there. So we continue to, we endorse that recommendation out of Group 1, and we will be pushing for it.
Thank you all very much, and thanks to the people on the organizing committee.
lot of flack on the mic here. I just said that when you come up, there's a piece of tape here that says, please do not touch microphones. So it's just, I'm just trying to enforce the rules here at the college. All right, I'd now like to introduce to you, we've talked about him a lot, and now you'll hear from him directly, Dominic Perry from the Leadership Roundtable. Dominic?
So if we could switch to the Leadership Roundtable slides. So the first thing that you need to know about me is that I am Italian, and that means I can't really talk behind the podium really well, because I need to move around and wave my hands. The second smaller point is that, there we go. The second smaller point is that my father is an Italian immigrant who went to Louisville, Kentucky, so I like to say my dad is an Italian who learned to speak English in Kentucky. Imagine what his accent is like, and that's where I live. So it's really, really a delight to be here, and what I want to do in a pretty brief amount of time is to first just give you a sense of who the Leadership Roundtable is. I have no expectation that many of you are familiar with who we are, so I want to give that perspective, and then just try to frame what's going on here in the context of what's happening around the country. How do I advance my slides? Oh, thank you. Great, thanks. So the Leadership Roundtable is an organization that was founded actually after the Boston abuse crisis happened in 2002. And a group of really dedicated and just like many of the folks in this room, really talented lay people said, we love our church, number one, and number two, we recognize there is a serious problem and we believe we can help. And these were people like a former executive at Chase Bank in New York, another executive who had served assistant secretary to the U.S. Treasury and then went on to Goldman Sachs, another a three-star general who ended up commanding troops in the Green Zone in Iraq, some really high-quality folks, and they said, we want to help the church. We want to bring leadership and management expertise to the church, and that was in 2003 when the group began to be formed. It was formalized into a 501c3 in 2005. And so you can see our mission, which is to promote best practices and accountability across these domains in the Catholic Church. There's a couple things that are very important about how we work. First and foremost, we never take a position on anything related to theology. We don't tell the church what it ought to be teaching in that domain. We don't see that as our expertise. We see our expertise as being around leadership, management, communication, and these things that can help the church. Secondly, we never work in a diocese or any other environment because we work with national church organizations and religious communities and universities. But in a diocese, we would never work in a diocese where the bishop didn't want us. And so one of the things that was important to us was to have a conversation with Bishop Malone and say, is it okay if we're here? That's just a basic principle. And in very short order, to be quite honest, he invited us to be here, and we're delighted to be here. The role that we will play in this is to try actually to be a neutral party. To try to bring an outside perspective to inform both what Mission to Restore Trust does and to inform what the diocese is doing. And as you can see up on the screen, since we were incorporated in 2005, we worked in 120 dioceses in the United States. There's roughly 180, so that's about 2/3 of the dioceses in the United States. And since last summer, when the Pennsylvania grand jury and the McCarrick story came out, we have been served 50 dioceses around the country. So this has been a very, very busy time for us as an organization. We do everything from working in situations like this, where there is, obviously there's been a tremendous breach of trust, and there's also substantial lay energy to engage the church, to situations where it's much more quiet, where we might just simply advise a bishop, or we might advise a diocesan finance team, or that type of thing. So it goes across the board. All right. I want to use my time kind of quickly and wisely so that you have a chance to talk about your next steps. One of the things I will say is that there is no formula for this. There is no recipe for this. There is no here, follow these 5 steps and you'll fix it. I think you've probably already figured that all out. We are really moving into uncharted territory in our church. And I think that is both frightening and at times tragic because of what has put us here, but it also holds great potential. And that's the lens that I'd like to offer and encourage us to think about it through. So let me just show you a couple slides. As John mentioned, we have an annual gathering every year, and in this year it was February 1st and 2nd in Washington, D.C., and it was our annual summit, a Catholic Partnership Summit, and we had over 200 participants from around the United States, among them Cardinal O'Malley, who we've talked about this morning from Boston, Cardinal Supich from Chicago, which is where I'm from, and also Cardinal Tobin from New Jersey, as well as a number of other archbishops. Archbishop Listecki from Milwaukee that we were talking about was there, and a number of other lay leaders from all different types of levels, as well as university folks and so forth. And really spent some time thinking, and the whole gathering was focused on the abuse crisis. And how do we ultimately respond to this as a church? And so we talked about and identified some guiding principles, which I think you'll see align pretty nicely to what you've already produced somewhat independently here in Buffalo. One thing I noticed is a couple folks taking pictures of the slides. At the end, I'll show you a link to our website where you'll get a comprehensive report that has everything that's on this and then some that you can download. It's a PDF and it's free. Okay, but things like, what do we want to do? We want to impact the church around transparency, accountability, competency, justice, and trust. One of the things I know is in the room is what we would call righteous anger, justifiable anger. You can't have things like this happen and not be angry. And we want to recognize that, and the justice dimension of this is absolutely essential. The place where we try to work is to say, if there should be justified anger and righteous anger, where do you want to direct it? Ultimately, I think everybody in this room loves this church. You wouldn't be here if you didn't love the local church in Buffalo. So let's try as much as we can without dismissing the hurt and the pain in any way. But can we direct that anger towards building the church of Buffalo that you want, that has these qualities? So to do that, you're going to have to impact the leadership and management culture of the church, keeping in line. And again, I don't hear anybody in the room saying, let's get rid of this stuff, the beliefs, the ecclesiology, the canon law. But we're going to have to change the culture and restore the trust, which you've talked about so much, based on measurable, visible outcomes. I'm not sure who it was that said trust but verify. That might have been Nancy, right? We had to restore that trust, and the only way we're going to be able to restore it is to verify and identify what we're going to measure. That's going to require a partnership of both ordained and lay Catholics focused on the mission. Whenever we say the mission, we mean, what are we really here to do? Right? And what is the call of Christ to us in the 21st century? To lean forward and not dwell in the past. And again, I do not want that to be understood in any way to be dismissive of the pain and the hurt and the kind of stories that we heard and the story we heard this morning. It's incredibly instructive. But I think most of the victims, as I think we just heard, would say, the number one thing the victims want is to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future. So focusing on the future. And being realistic and translate into things that are practical and actionable. So these are a series of guiding principles that we came up with, and I think they align pretty nicely to what you developed. We also have a number of key points, and these are in our reports. We have been calling this a twin crisis. The obvious crisis is the crisis of abuse that's happened. The second crisis is a crisis of leadership, and a leadership structure that has not been able to manage this crisis of abuse. And so we call it a twin crisis. And this silence is no longer an option. Bishops have to act now. And we've been very heartened. And one of the things I think that we can bring is to be able to point MRT and the diocese to bishops around the country who have decided that they are not going to wait for a directive from Rome or anything else, that they are going to move forward. And we want to encourage that. A recognition ultimately that the heart of all abuse is an abuse of power. So the story we heard this morning was of a young man being with someone who was in a much more powerful position than him, so much so ultimately that he didn't feel like he could even tell anybody that it would be believable, and if he did, he'd be the one who got in trouble. So it's an abuse of power. And we've failed, as in the story, you call clergy to accountability. But to make this work, everybody's got to be at the table. Bishops, religious, clergy and lay, mothers and fathers. And the reforms can't just be head reforms, because the heart, the damage that's been done here isn't damage. It's not like you lost an intellectual argument. Hearts have been hurt, souls have been hurt. It's got to be a heart and mind solution. We also talked about a word that has been coming out of Rome an awful lot called synodality. Raise your hand if you know what synodality is. Yeah, raise your hand if you don't. Right? So I'll just simply say it's a fancy church word to say, let's do it all together. Everybody's got a role to play in this. Each of us have our own respective roles to play. Each of our voices is important. We work best as a church when we find a way to create the opportunity for everybody to be together. And ultimately, let's not think about this as just a fix-it project to address the abuse in leadership, which we absolutely have to do. But let's think about this, about the future of the mission of the church. Because as several people have said this morning, where's anybody under 40 in this room? So the future mission of the church, and it's not just that, it's the mission that Pope Francis is calling us to go out, to go to the margins, to meet the needs of a hurting world in many ways. So this potentially becomes a door that opens not only to, and first and foremost, we have to address the issue of the abuse and put the structures in to make sure it never happens again, and create a way for laity to be engaged and partner in their rightful role in partnering with the leader, the kind of formal leadership of the church. But let's let that momentum carry us forward to create the church we want our children and grandchildren to be part of. So, as I said, all of this is compiled in a report that's a PDF on our website. Our website is simply leadershiproundtable.org. If you go there, right in the front, it's response to the abuse crisis. You click that, it opens a page, and it's got this report and a series of other things. We've been producing a series of documents and holding a series of conversations ever since August around this specific topic. Okay. Now I know that our next step is to talk about next steps. So I don't know if you want me to do that or if you want to just go into it. Okay. All right. So here's what I would say. And the first thing is there's no formula for this, because we're really in a time we just have never been in this place as a church. But I just jotted down some things as I listened to you. The first thing is, because we're in an uncharted territory, some of the questions, which I completely understand, are just things we can't know. How serious is the bishop in this? Does he get it? I don't know. I mean, and that's one of the things I've been very clear about, is that I haven't been around for what's been happening in the last couple of months. We've been kind of watching it, and Carrie Robinson, my colleague, was here to speak in October. But I don't think even if you are, anybody can know those kind of questions. And some of the other questions that came forward about this is something that's going to have to unfold, and we have the opportunity to create something actually that's unprecedented. This joint commission that the bishop himself proposed is not something that you really see. It's not a standard practice in a diocese. So we're going to invent this as we go forward. We'll invent it. It's more about starting with a set of principles like what we have and like your foundational principles, and say, okay, so as we create this thing going forward, we keep tacking back and saying, is it holding true to what we have said our foundational principles are? I think one really important thing then is to identify, and I know this sounds a little, what's the word, perhaps boring, but identify the structures in the organization that's going to let it happen. So I see that in two places. What does this joint commission end up looking like? How's it structured? What's its mandate? What's it supposed to be focused on? What are the results it's supposed to deliver? All that is to be determined, and that's part of the role that I'll play to try to help with that. The second is to think about yourselves. What you have done as a group of volunteers is extraordinary. But ultimately, any group of volunteers' energy begins to run out or hit its limits. So what is the ongoing structure that you want to create for MRT that allows you to move forward and allows all of you to stay engaged at the level in which you can be? The second is to broaden the engagement, and a number of people talked about that, but to think about how does this move out to engage the priests of the diocese? How does this move out to be something that people in parishes can be aware of and engaged in? How do you engage younger Catholics, fallen away Catholics who may have fallen away for the very reasons that we're discussing in this room? So thinking about how that happens, and we have a number of processes we've used in other places to help that happen. And that leads to the third point, which is, I think, beginning to think at this point about what a communication strategy will look like. I think John alluded to that in terms of the Joint Commission. How do you tell the story? How do you let people know what's going on? And how do you use communications to get people involved? And this, I would offer to you as one thing as we think about this, is how, if we want younger people to be involved, they communicate in ways that are different than we do. So just beginning to think about and get comfortable with, and I'm just going to kind of take it to an extreme, how many of you would have been comfortable to be part of something like this through a Facebook webcast, which is the way you're going to get a lot of younger people? How many of you would be comfortable with a lot of this, the communication happening through Facebook or Twitter or other forms of social media, right? And one of the things is to say, I'm not saying it has to only be that way, but if you want to look for means to get them in, you've got to also work in the channels in which they work in. So a communication strategy that takes into account the diversity of the groups that you're trying to engage. I do think also what you have produced is fabulous, but at one point John talked about one of the recommendations of actually sitting down with the diocesan lawyers and getting clear. I think one of the next moves for you is to begin to talk to the diocese as much as you can through the commission and probably subcommittees that come off of it and work groups, so that there can be a partnership and you can learn some of the things that they've done and what might be possible, and you're not working just in a silo. The last thing that I would simply say is you're going to want to set milestones along the way so that you know that you're making progress. That's one thing. But I think you're going to also want to decide where you want to focus so that you both don't overwhelm yourselves and also overwhelm the diocese. One of the things in the story that John told was that the original full set of recommendations kind of went up to the bishop, and there was a kind of almost a pause button, and then John sharpened them and into a series of more actionable things that he could kind of quickly work with, and we saw great progress in the last 4 or 5 days. So being focused and clear, that's all going to be part of a process as you go forward. I will end by saying this. It may be hard for you to hear, but I see tremendous hope here for this one reason. As Maureen alluded last night when we were at dinner, I said that I can think of another diocese in this country with one of the best young bishops who could write everything that was in your documents and up on my slides himself. But the problem that he has is he's by himself. And he does not, what the conversation we're having with him is how does he identify engaged, talented laity who will partner with him to make the words on the screen a reality? What we have in Buffalo, what you have here in this room and the many others who maybe may not be here this morning, are lots of talented, engaged laity who want to partner with the diocese. That's actually one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, and you've already solved it. So I see great hope for you going forward, and I'll do everything I can to help you. Thanks.
You know, that's really kind of a perfect segue. I imagine some of us here are thinking about, is this enough? Is this as much as we hoped? And we're probably, you know, the full spectrum of thoughts there. And, you know, one of the most promising things that came out of this is that the Leadership Roundtable is engaged, because that gives us structure and expertise to continue the work that we need to do. And I do change in organizations, and I whispered to Maureen, it's kind of a really interesting perspective, the story that Dominic just shared with us, because the urgency that we have in terms of the laity getting involved, you know, it's an interesting perspective. I'll just leave it there. So next steps for us. So our work groups, I alluded to, we've got 50 pages of reports, and we have a gift for each of the work groups that we have about 6-7 pages of recommendations and thoughts and comments, not 6-7 pages per work group, 6-7 pages total. But what we'd like the work groups to do, and maybe we can do this today, is decide how you want to take those recommendations and thoughts, and what's your process going to be for looking at them and making decisions about essentially refining and finalizing your recommendations. And you've got a number of options. You can say, we're final. You know, we will not edit this any further. This is our recommendation. This is our final recommendation. You could say, we're going to meet as a whole and we're going to refine it in totality, all of us together working collectively. You could say, well, we're going to form a subgroup and we're going to delegate to that subgroup and ask them to take the feedback and refine it and finalize it. Or you could theoretically say, I delegate that to the organizing committee and ask them to refine it and give them the authority to refine it based on their expertise and feedback. So those are the work groups. We'd like you guys to think about which one of those feels best for each of your work groups. And what I'll do is I will send the work group sponsors and leaders and facilitators the feedback. I think, John, you and I might need to figure out if we've got the final document. So it might take us a day or so, but we'll get that out to you so that you can look at it. But today, maybe while you're together, think about how you want to move forward to do that. And then, Maureen, do you want to come up and talk about signing up for phase 2?
Before we get to phase 2, just on the where we stand with the reports, you see it on the summary of the recommendations. There were in some of the reports, I would say, pretty strong assertions of fact that may not be correct, and that's why we've got to figure out. Work groups might want to think about the tone or the language of the report to say. Maybe it appears or our perception is this, as opposed to saying that this is the way it is when it turned out it wasn't. There was, not to pick on Group 1, but there was an assertion in an earlier draft of Group 1's report that the council for the diocese actually sat on the diocesan review board, and that we checked and it just isn't the case. So I don't want us to undercut our credibility by having erroneous assertions of fact and being stated emphatically. So I think we ought to maybe try to back off on the language. Just that's for the groups to consider. As Stephanie says, if the group says this is our report and we want it to be submitted in its present form, we'll respect the group's wishes and we'll do that. But I think there some additional work there would benefit the final product here. So stay tuned for the comments on those.
Yeah, so just some closing thoughts. One of the things that Dominic said to us is it's important to find out, like, who's in for the next phase of this, and starts with the MRT group. No, sister told us when we were here in November that, is this a fire alarm? I'm sorry? Okay. It's new learning. Sister Margaret told us that, you know, this is going to be a long haul, and I think that we all feel very blessed to have had this many people involved in this first phase. But what we need to know, and you should all feel very proud of what's been produced, but we need to know is who's in for this next phase, and that could mean who might be interested. We don't even know how this joint commission is going to get set up or who exactly is going to be on it, but we would really like to know from folks in this room and others that couldn't be here today who might be in for an active role in this next step. So we can do that in a couple ways. You can indicate on one of the cards today and leave it with us. We're going to have a place on the website at the early part of next week for folks to go in and indicate, yeah, I'm up for taking another kind of phase of this. Or you can talk to any of us here today. We're going to stick around for a little bit if people had questions or other comments that we didn't get to. But it's important for us to know who would like to stay involved. The good news is for all of you in the room, any of you that were part of these work groups, we have you on our distribution list, and you will be the first people to know in terms of what's going on. We also have about another 75 folks that registered on our website who weren't able to be actively engaged in the work groups, but who are very interested in the work of this MRT, and we'll continue to keep that group informed as well. And then, as has been mentioned a couple times, we know we have to put together a more formal communication plan. But it's important for us to know who's up for some further work as we move ahead. So. And I think that's a wrap. And again, we tried to stick as close to the timing as we could. So thank you all very much.